How you end a game is just as important as how you start it, and one of the greatest strengths behind a memorable ending is an amazing final boss. Seeing as this is a Yakuza-centric channel, it's about time we go in-depth on the many opponents that have marked the conclusions of the games over the years. So join me as we rank every single final boss of the Yakuza franchise in celebration of the channel hitting 9,000 subscribers. The criteria we'll be using is as follows, and seeing as these will be personal rankings, I'll leave a link to the tier list in the top comment, so you can try ranking them yourselves. Another thing to note is that in the case of games that have received remakes over time, specifically Yakuza 1, 2, and Ishin, we'll be treating the original and remake fights as joint entries to avoid repetition, though I will go over the mechanical differences between the fights where it is necessary. Lastly, heavy spoilers await you in this video, so please refer to the timestamps in the description if you wish to avoid certain entries from being spoiled for you. With all that said, let's begin the tier list. The first final boss of the franchise is none other than Nishikiyama Akira, Kiryu's estranged brother figure and someone who'd instill more and more adoration in the Yakuza community as the series kept evolving. His original portrayal relied on the classic brother figure who has gone astray trope, but even with this early depiction of the character, RGG has shown a talent for making something that initially felt familiar suddenly feel exciting to see unfold. Nishiki's fall into villainy is genuinely believable, being the result of unfortunate circumstances, jealousy, and the loss of a loved one, and this solid base would only be improved upon with each revisit to the character. As far as creating the first final boss ever, it was as promising of a start as you could have hoped for, and there's little to criticize here narrative-wise, especially when you add the further exploration of his and Kiryu's brother dynamic in Zero, as well as the new scenes found in Yakuza Kiwami. Now, with regards to the more technical aspects, this is where things get a little bit more interesting. Looking at the base version of the boss fight in Yakuza 1, it immediately set the standard for every boss fight afterwards amazingly, having us fight Nishiki at the apex of the city in a secret area within a massive skyscraper, which, despite its magnitude, still allows for an intimate atmosphere from start to finish. You have multiple QTE segments to naturally transition the fight from phase to phase, Nishiki's moveset is flashy and really fun to fight against, and while the first iteration of the fight lacks a dynamic intro, the tragic atmosphere amplified through "For Whose Sake" still ingrains the fight exceptionally well in your memory. Personally, I still prefer the version of the fight from the remake by a tiny bit, as some of the QTEs that were reused from the boss fights in Yakuza 0 and 5 actually felt like natural fits in this fight thanks to the interspliced flashbacks of the duo's past interactions. The fight managed to retain nearly everything great about the original and just kept adding on to it, most notably with the glorious dynamic intro and more ominous iteration of "For Whose Sake." To me, even after all this time, Nishiki truly deserves an S-tier placement on this type of list, both for being the start of this series' legacy and for how his own legacy has only gotten better with time. Now, let's see how the rest of the series fares against this high standard. Up next, we have another fan-favorite character, Goda Ryuji. Now, this will probably be the first divisive take of the list, but personally, I feel that Ryuji was rather underdeveloped in both Yakuza 2 and Kiwami 2, despite the intriguing basis he was initially given. I often cite the amount of antagonistic figures introduced in these games as being one of the main reasons for that. Because when you include Ryuji's arcs from Dead Souls and RGG Online into the mix, he genuinely becomes one of the finest boss-type characters of the series. However, if we just look at his writing in 2 alone, he's more of a diamond in the rough than anything else. His motivation of being the one true dragon is admirable in concept, but the way it is communicated to the player makes it feel like he is just chasing the title for petty reasons entirely dependent on the weight of the dragon mythos, rather than for uniquely personal aspirations. Wanting to be the strongest is something that can apply to a number of villains after all, so the over-reliance on it in the dialogue detracts from the many unique qualities that differentiate Ryuji from the other villains. For example, the fact he refuses to fight Kiryu at Stardust in a very Virgil-esque manner as he wants to defeat his rival at full power. or the moment when he saves Haruka because he detests Sengoku's underhanded tactics, getting in the way of Ryuji's personal journey of fulfillment. Even the more self-reflective exchange at the Tojo HQ, relating to his emotional distance from his father, shows that there is much underlying nuance present to him, but never shown to the extent it deserved to be shown. Still, given that he is the first dragon-bearing boss we fight in the series, and an exceptional one at that, the preceding criticism is more of a slight against Kiwami 2 for not following in the steps of K1 and how it deepened the promising character even further. Having said that, the core of the character is still a solid evolution from who Nishiki was. Writing aside, what about the fights against Ryuji? Well, this is one of the rare instances where the fight in the remake is an improvement over the original on all accounts, particularly due to the amount of hyper armor Ryuji had in OG2, making for a tedious encounter to revisit. On a brighter note, it should be noted how the final QTE in both versions of the fight was one of the rare instances of an insta-death state, in the event you failed the button prompts, which genuinely makes the stakes of the fight feel even greater than before. The other QTEs are as brutal as necessary, the snowy embellishments of the area make the fight feel as somber as the one against Nishiki, but in a way that was uniquely its own, and the song A Scattered Moment was masterfully implemented in both fights, though I personally prefer the one from the remake for the added symphonic elements. All in all, while I think this was a bit of a step down from the first final boss of the series, I think Ryuji still deserves an A tier when we look at the complete picture, and the fact we got to fight him several times in the game made the final encounter feel significantly more special in retrospect. So, yeah. Now, before we get to the game released after Yakuza 2, we might as well address the strange inclusion that was the Majima Saga. As luck would have it, Kiwami 2 was one of the few Yakuza games that would get a side campaign with its own final boss, which in this case would be Ibuchi K. Now, for starters, it should be stated that this is one of the weakest bosses in the series, as the only two things people remember him for are his voice actor and the dynamic intro that many say was what the entire budget of the Majima Saga went into financing. Ibuchi is a case of a now classic Yakuza character trope, that being the cowardly businessman. The type of guy that schemes behind the scenes, puppeteering everyone to his liking, but when push comes to shove, ends up relying on firearms, sucker punches, and other underhanded tactics to even out the playing field. Narrative-wise, he is actually a great choice to add more nuance to the events of Yakuza 2, as the idea of money becoming increasingly important in running a Gokudo hierarchy has been prevalent since Yakuza 4. So reintroducing it here, during the birth of the rivalry with Yomi, was a natural feeling addition. Ibuchi wants to quote-unquote update the Yakuza, and ironic as it all may seem, he may have had a point with this train of thought, considering the future of the Tojo clan. Unfortunately, due to the short length of the Majima Saga and amount of fan service sprinkled throughout, there wasn't too much time to give this character the opportunity to be more than a cardboard cutout. Nevertheless, the other elements of the fight here still elevate him above certain final bosses we've yet to cover. He's literally given one of the best dynamic intros in the franchise, with some beautifully over-the-top fight choreography. The OST, Update with Gunfire, is easily my favorite out of the three boss themes we've covered thus far, and while we don't have any QTEs to embellish the fight, the fact we fight at the Cabaret Grand is such a nice touch considering the amount of time we spent here during the events of Yakuza 0. By nature of this series' high standard for final bosses, Ibuchi has to go into a low C tier, but the fight was still quite enjoyable despite the evident shortcomings, which is something I won't be able to say for the upcoming entry on the list. So, you all remember how I stated that this ranking is subjective earlier on in the video. However, I'd argue that nearly everyone who has played Ryuga Gotoku Kenzan could argue that this game's final boss is objectively the worst one of the entire franchise. In fact, he was so disappointing that his inclusion started the trend of Yakuza fans making distinctions between the developer-intended final boss of the game versus the true final boss of the game that would test your knowledge of the entry's mechanics. In this case, most people would consider Sasaki Kojiro to be the true final boss of Kenzan due to his exceptional writing, gorgeous fight, and setting. But in reality, The boss that concludes this amazing game is Tenkai. To avoid overcomplicating things, he's another cowardly manipulator type of character that aims to set up his own regime by tricking his underlings into committing political assassinations, exhibited in cases like when Musashi and Majima were tricked into attacking the household of a Tokugawa family member and were then framed for even graver acts afterwards. With that in mind, while Tenkai being written as nothing but a manipulator, and by association being utterly incompetent in a fight, makes sense from a narrative standpoint, old hat as it may be, it also makes for a horrible fight to experience. He has no dynamic intro, no QTEs or action segments, the OST he is given is the generic one for this game, and all he does during the fight is shoot you and run away. Basically like Jingu minus the bodyguards, or the final boss of Yakuza 4 minus the bodyguards. It makes sense to want to portray him as a pathetic opponent, and he is someone you would want to beat into the dust, but compared to the rest of the series' bosses, Tenkai is but a whimper that attempts to conclude the dozens of encounters of the final chapter in a satisfactory manner. Fortunately, the scenes succeeding his execution make for a damn amazing finale, but yeah, Tenkai himself is destined for the bottom of the list any way you cut it. On a brighter note, the next mainline entry gives us another diamond of a boss, in the form of Mine Yoshitaka. Right off the bat, I won't spend too much time deconstructing this character here, seeing as I've already done a proper character study on him on the channel, as well as a detailed analysis of his boss theme Fly. So here's the Cliff Notes version. Mine is originally presented as more of a manipulator/businessman type of character, which will make you think that his final boss fight will be comparable to that against Ibuchi. But no. Yakuza 3 did a fantastic job at sprinkling in moments that would successfully evolve Mine from our initially limited perception into having him serve as the hybrid of a businessman and an incredibly skilled combatant. This is evident from the fact that his first scene shows him actively training, a courtesy very few bosses in the series would get, especially this early on, to exhibiting his brutality and physical prowess in the way he executed Kanda and vented his frustration on the Hakuho clan, to even the fact that he was the only final boss to physically wear out Kiryu after the fight, without any life-threatening injuries contributing to said exhaustion. To add to this, his actions are befitting of a villain, and no matter how much the game humanizes him via his orphan backstory, making him the perfect what-if analog to Kiryu, the game still refrains from portraying him as a genuine good guy. His attempted redemption is even something that went against the wishes of both Kiryu and Daigo, but still a decision he would stick with in the end, to try and take responsibility for the numerous mistakes he'd made, rather than to live on at the cost of perpetually being reminded of them. He's technically the first final boss to be given a proper dynamic intro in the form we now identify them as. The different QTEs in the fight were tastefully implemented, Fly is a song dripping with lewd and narrative harmony, and Mine is the first final boss to utilize style switching in combat. Even people who actively dislike Yakuza 3 tend to see him in a positive light, with regards to ending the game with a bang, but as far as I'm concerned, my adoration for this game has long been apparent, and the quality of Mine as a character is one of the biggest reasons for that. So this is an easy S tier for me. Moving on to Yakuza 4, you'll notice how the tier list includes multiple bosses from the game, and that's because Yakuza games including multiple protagonists are often constructed in a way where each of the final fights feels like the culmination of one of our heroes' journeys, so it felt right to include the 4 bosses that were all tailor-made for our protagonists here. And the first of them is Arai Hiroaki. Arai is a fun twist on the pre-established formula, as he serves as a former member of the police force who initially joined the Yakuza as part of an assignment, only to find himself enamored with the values and wished-upon ideals that seem to define the underworld. His dynamic with Akiyama in part 1 of the game was genuinely an interesting one to see, so I feel that the biggest thing going against Arai is his significantly shortened screen time afterwards. I feel that most of the villains of the series tend to get the short end of the stick when it comes to multi-character narratives exceeding 2 protagonists, meaning that Arai is merely the first of many casualties from that form of storytelling. You will have forgotten much of his and Akiyama's backstory by the time you fight him in the finale, And even after revisiting the exchanges in Part 1, it will all start feeling like a collection of solid concepts that weren't fleshed out enough to stand out. It's almost like the final bosses of Yakuza 4 were meant to be seen as a collective enemy rather than unique individuals, but I digress. Arai, much like the other bosses of this game, has a personalized alternate version of For Faith serving as his boss theme, and I'll just say that each iteration of the song is perfect. They all serve as the perfect excitement builders for the ensuing boss fights, and they all stand out in different ways. This guy's dynamic intro is also one of the best ones in the game, alongside Daigo's, and the moveset that is used is the perfect mirror to Akiyama's Frenzy of Kicks. I feel that the main thing dragging this fight down, compared to the likes of Nishiki and Mine, is, again, a lack of refinement in what is presented, which is why I'll be ranking Arai into B tier for the time. Up next is Saejima's final boss, Kido Takeshi. Compared to Arai, I'd argue that the narrative side of Kido's involvement was actually done a lot better, partially because he's given a comparable spotlight in parts 1 and 2 before all sections of the story slowly start intertwining, and the fact that we see the beginning and end of his dynamic with Saejima directly in Yakuza 4. There's no case of flashbacks establishing emotional bonds. These two quickly establish a form of mentorship that feels believable, and the respect that is shown towards Saejima feels warranted because of it. He is a legend of the Yakuza life after all, so seeing an up-and-coming kid with a lot of potential look up to him while striving to rise through the ranks makes the nature of their final fight feel deserved. While his writing still leaves much to be desired when compared to the finest of the series, he is still a solid addition to this game's roster. Now, as for the fight, we have the obvious issue of Saejima being a tank, and with Herculean Spirit being available, this fight can quickly turn into a joke because of it. However, this fight is also one of the rare instances where a healing mechanic from a boss was implemented perfectly, because it's not used to senselessly prolong the boss fights or offer last-minute symbolism to a character supposedly hiding their strength before the fight. Instead, it extends the fights to a natural length, considering Saejima's overwhelming strength. Mortals like Kido can only hope to survive a fight against this guy, so the fact that they foreshadowed the healing ability back during our chase section with him and reused it here made sure that this fight wouldn't be over too soon or feel like a massive letdown after the compelling fight against Arai. Memes aside, while the fight is less amazing than the one that preceded it, I'd say that Kido still deserves a B tier overall. He's a cool character, and it's a shame we didn't get to see more of him after Yakuza 4, even when taking his face actor's popularity into account. Continuing our train of villains, we have a familiar face, Dojima Daigo. Personally, I consider Daigo to be the best one out of 4's final bosses, and much of that is due to the pre-established character dynamic between him and Kiryu exploding to the surface. Even before the fatherly metaphors shown in Yakuza 6, it was already established that Daigo in his younger years used to genuinely look up to Kiryu, and Kiryu in turn trusted him to lead the Tojo clan into a brighter future post-Yakuza 2. The fact that Daigo was essentially given a sinking ship, considering the political and social state of Japan making the Yakuza lifestyle increasingly unsustainable, coupled with the latent frustration that's the result of personal ineptitude and your role model calling your mistakes out, makes for the best form of frustration venting you could ask for. One that was only outdone by Infinite Wealth years and years later. Narratively, this fight makes perfect sense. The dynamic intro is filled with rage, the fact that Daigo's moveset is even more fun to go up against than it was in Yakuza 2 is fantastic, and the entirety of this fight comes together just as it should. The only downside is that the nature of Yakuza 4's narrative being rather inconsequential due to Yakuza 5 actively contradicting or repeating a number of its key developments means that this fight and its outcome are retroactively lessened by what came after it, meaning that even this fight will reside in B tier. Having said that, anytime I replay Yakuza 4, this is the fight that I look forward to the most. And now, to conclude the ensemble of villainry, we have Munakata Seishiro. Once again, we have a pathetic manipulator puppeteering everyone around him, though I'd argue his tactics and motives are a good fit for the overall tone of Yakuza 4. We've always known that there were corrupt cops observing the underworld, so having someone who's basically on top of the hierarchy serve as our final obstacle, and one that is tailor-made for the protagonist that fights him, is a great choice. Tanimura concludes his arc of acceptance and personal growth perfectly, by nature of how he decides to handle Munakata's misdeeds, and the dynamic intro we see is just a perfect what the hell moment to sell the prelude to the encounter. Sadly, this is where my praise stops, because Munakata is the second worst boss of the entire series, even though you fight him with one of the most entertaining movesets out of any protagonist. To dial it back a bit, if you remember the fight with Jingu in Kiwami and the final boss of Kenzan, well, this is the worst amalgamation of the two imaginable. Because, mechanically speaking, Munakata is essentially their love child. Oh dear god, that's a disturbing image. Let's please move on. Anyway, he hides behind an absurd amount of underlings, shoots from a distance, and then persistently runs away once the coast is cleared. Just like with Tenkai, it makes sense narratively, but makes for a flaccid flop of a final boss encounter. While I adore using Tanimura's parry against this army, the encounter as a whole is exceptionally weak to look back upon. Though thankfully, the various protagonists manage to turn this endeavor into something positive and uplifting despite it all. And so, with yet another villain in D tier, let's move on to the spin-off years of Yakuza. The next three entries boasted massive experimentation with the series' core formula, and the bosses that concluded these journeys were pretty notable because of it. First in line is the final boss of Kurohyou 1, Shinjo Reiji. This guy initially seems like the prime example of a new final boss archetype, that being someone who's less of a character and more of a chaotic entity. Someone almost inhuman that you feel even more compelled to overcome because of it. However, there is quite a bit of underlying depth present here as well. To avoid overcomplicating things, Reiji was trained in a lethal martial arts style by the main manipulator of the events of Kurohyou. It just so happens that this manipulator, known as Masa, was also a bitter opponent of our protagonist's father, Taizan, having gravely injured the latter in a cowardly attack years ago. Considering the personal and combat growth of our protagonist Tatsuya, much of which came from the guidance of his father, the fight against Reiji serves a dual purpose: putting an end to Masa's plans and taking revenge for Taizan's sake. So yeah, Reiji is basically a tool used to complete a journey of personal growth, and was a great inclusion. The actual lead up to the fight is rather messy though, since Tatsuya had no reason to give the villains the item they were after just to offer both sides a stake in the fight, unless the point was for him to act as cheekily as he did in the earlier parts of the story, meaning that while he may have grown, he's still that kid we first met in chapter 1, just better. But that's enough of a narrative overview for the time. What about the fight? Well, we do have a Kurohyou-style dynamic intro showing us both combatants, which is a nice touch, and a brief action segment signaling Reiji going into his heat mode, which includes him utilizing a highly telegraphed yet absurdly dangerous heat action moving forward. If you've played either of the Kurohyou games, all of this is to be expected, but it still helps differentiate this character from the other final bosses on the list. The OST used is an instrumental version of the theme song Muppet, which is amazing, and frankly, the only thing over which I would criticize this fight mechanically is that Reiji's moveset is pretty boring to go up against. Other than that, this is actually a really solid take on a different type of Yakuza climax. So where do we put him on the list? Overall, I'd say he's a high B tier placement. Might sound a bit harsh, considering the amount of praise I've given to the character, but this fight still had to be constructed around limitations specific to the hardware it was developed for, which is a noticeable step down from the other bosses despite the astonishing execution of concepts. Fortunately, this boss would allow two other entries on the list to be vastly improved upon by comparison, but we'll get to that soon enough. Up next, we have the most unique entry on this list for a multitude of reasons: the final boss of Yakuza Dead Souls, Nikaido Tetsuo. He's originally presented as the new head of the Goryeo clan, and someone who greatly looks up to our newly resurrected Ryuji, to the point where the former aims to take revenge on Kiryu for putting the Golden Dragon into his current predicament. Despite Ryuji being against the idea of revenge, Nikaido is nonetheless hell-bent on finishing off the Tojo clan himself, and aims to achieve this via something called the Thanatos virus, with the help of an individual known as Didi. Following a very Yakuza 5-esque attempt at gathering key players to a select location, and a multitude of zombie encounters, we're left with a rather strange twist to justify the final 2 fights of the game. Essentially, we have an overly emotional underling, in this case Nikaido, being taken advantage of by the real villain of the story, and turned into a monster through a stronger strand of the Thanatos virus. An interesting expansion on what we'd seen with Reiji and Kurohyou, considering the absence of reason and emotion in the fights that will ensue. Now, for the purposes of this entry, I'll be treating the final 2 encounters of this game as a joint entry, seeing as the Oikazuchi Omega fight is essentially just a set piece that serves as the epilogue of the first fight before Nikaido fully evolved. OST-wise, these fights have the most notable sleeper hits of the franchise, absurdly good songs that deserve more recognition, particularly for the lead guitar melodies that were implemented and the overwhelmingly epic atmosphere that sonically defines them. Mechanically though, these fights become much harder to deconstruct, seeing as the shooter-style gameplay means we can't offer points of reference that would lead to somewhat quantifiable values with which we can compare them to the rest of the bosses in Yakuza. Precision aiming will be key in both of these boss fights, either while you're looking for Nikaido's heart in the first fight, or when you're trying to aim grenades and missiles into the Omega variant later. And while this wouldn't be an issue if the game was stable, this is Yakuza Dead Souls we're talking about. As much as I adore it, emulating this game was a nightmare, and these fights crashed on me around 10 times before I could eventually finish the story, which contributed to me enjoying the fights much less than the others. It would be one thing if the crashing was completely non-existent while playing on real hardware, but again, we're talking about Dead Souls, and I have it on good authority that the PS3 just can't handle this entry during a number of critical moments in the playthrough. But hey, if RGG would release a remaster for the PS5, maybe this game would be a bit higher on the tier list. Who knows? Mechanical oddities aside, between the lack of what I'd label truly impactful characterization for Nikaido, and the fact that this fight could realistically exist outside the confines of a conventional Yakuza boss tier list due to the novelty alone, I find it hard to place this entry in a definitive tier. So, for the time being, I will rank it based on personal enjoyment, which in this case would relegate this guy to a high C tier. Alright, now we're getting to a phenomenal entry. The final boss of Kurohyou 2, the man with the single greatest boss theme of the franchise, Nozaki Ryo. Much like with Mine, I adored this character so much that I dedicated a standalone video to deconstructing him. So once again, we'll be sticking to the essentials in terms of Ryo's writing. At the time of Kurohyou 2's release, this was arguably the most outstanding final boss of the series, with the allusions to mysticism surrounding him, and Ryo showcasing abilities that framed him to be somewhat of a demigod in the eyes of the supporting cast. In essence, he was a character who was forced into a life of crime from a very young age, trying his hardest to take care of his longtime girlfriend Shizuka, who suffered from a severe illness for most of her life. No act he committed was too much if it meant the two of them could keep on living, and yet when Shizuka was to have an organ transplant that could finally save her, a politician bribed her doctor so that his son could get an organ transplant instead. As a result, Shizuka passed away, and Ryo began his path of revenge. You can see elements of what would later define Nishiki's downfall in Yakuza Kiwami in this game's character writing, although in Kurohyou, the route the writers have taken was distinctly more sadistic from the get-go, with Ryo's manipulative acts being very directly shown, and the gang he commanded drowning Sotenbori and Kamurocho in a sea of violence. This guy is a menace, and yet RGG still managed to humanize him in a way that wouldn't undo his misdeeds, but make his downfall all the more tragic instead. As if the narrative wasn't enticing enough, this fight is everything you could hope for from a handheld Yakuza game, or even an early-era mainline game. Ryo has a glorious Kurohyou-style dynamic intro with a uniquely golden heat aura specifically designed for this entrance. The action sequence signaling the use of his signature attack is straight and to the point, and the animation of Ryo doing backflips while sending out shockwaves during combat is so absurd that it loops back around to being epic. As I've stated during the beginning of this entry, he has, in my opinion, the single best boss theme of the series, that being Born to be Wild. And unlike the final boss of Kurohyou 1, the licensed track here actually has vocals during the fight, which only amplifies the excitement even further. Lastly, the moveset that is used, one called Extreme Wild Dance, is one of the strongest that you can find in the game, and if you thought it was a fun style to face off against, just imagine how fun it is to use it after beating Ryo. It's no shock that this is an easy S-tier placement for me, considering how much I've been praising the Kurohyou games in the past, but trust me, even without the bias, this guy is one of the most outstanding creations in RGG's lengthy history. So yeah, play the Kurohyou games if you haven't already. Alright, now we have yet another Yakuza game with multiple protagonists, which means we will go over multiple bosses per segment yet again. First in line is Majima, who serves as Saejima's final boss. Now, the unfortunate thing about his involvement, and the involvement of every other final boss in Yakuza 5, is that the reasoning for fighting them pales in comparison to the fights. With regards to Majima, he was presumed to be dead for much of the story, until he reappears in the last scene of Shinada's part of the game, and he's then shown chained up by Kurosawa's men in the finale, forced to fight Saejima in order to save Haruka from a then unknown assailant. The point A to B that led us here is riddled with holes, as will be further inspected in that Yakuza 5 story analysis I keep foreshadowing on the channel. But for the purposes of a boss tier list, this is one of the worst lead-ups to any Majima fight in the franchise. It makes sense that these two would want to save Haruka, but the fact that Majima was either overpowered by nameless Kuroha family goons off-screen, or alternatively let himself get captured to trick Kurosawa to have a long-awaited one-on-one with his kyodai, all the while hoping Daigo miraculously heals from his gunshot wounds from the rooftop exchange and jumps in afterwards, puts a damper on what is otherwise a highlight of any Yakuza game, i.e. a chaotic fight with the Mad Dog that entices you before and after the encounter. Narrative aside, this is probably the best one-on-one fight against Majima in the series, as every single QTE from our fight in Yakuza 4 returns with some brand new additions. The dynamic intro is as beautiful as you'd expect, and the OST Receive and Slash You is another in line of great Receive You reinterpretations. Probably my favorite part of this fight is that Majima just casually throws out a number of doppelgangers while posing as one of them himself, a feature that will only get increasingly more absurd as we fight him in future games. I'm definitely showing my Majima bias here, because even with the mess that is Yakuza 5 story, I still find myself looking forward to this fight upon every new playthrough, and trying to offer alternate reasoning for why these two had to fight in the first place. There is an argument to be made that this fight is more so for Majima's sake, to prove that he is still as strong as his kyodai, so between that and the fact that this is the culmination of Majima's beat-em-up boss fights, I'll give this fight a very charitable low A tier. Next up, we have Baba-chan, Shinada's final boss. Being one of Kurosawa's many co-conspirators, Baba was tasked with shooting Haruka during the concert, but seeing as he has a change of heart, he tries to leave with his equipment in tow. Then he is met with Shinada, who clobbers him and starts speaking in well-articulated shonen sports metaphors that sadly go over Baba's head. In the ensuing confusion, the two wind up fighting, because it's not like Baba can afford to let a witness to his involvement run free, and Shinada conveniently promised Saejima that he'd try and help this new kyodai for the game if he came across him. Now, for starters, the setting for the fight is gorgeous, and the accompanying OST fits like a charm. Also, we have two new QTEs along with the reinterpretation of one from the fight with Saejima during part 2 of the game, which is a nice addition. Having said that, the fact we have to fight him as Shinada is something that drags many of these technical accomplishments down. Now, I know many people will just jump on the Shinada plays poorly bandwagon that is popular with this game, but the issue isn't Shinada's personal moveset, but rather that he has to face off against Baba's. Shinada is already a character where you need to invest significantly more effort to be as effective in combat as Kiryu or Saejima, which makes the process of figuring his unique quirks out pretty rewarding. But even when you come to grips with his moveset, there are certain bosses that just aren't fun to fight against unless you're as broken as Kiryu. Between the numerous God Break attacks he has, grab reversals, and occasional stun attacks, this fight will either nudge you to spam the exact same combo to stunlock Baba, or have your attempts at diversifying the moves utilized be squandered, as Shinada is consistently slammed to the ground. Between that, the fact that there is no dynamic intro, and the sheer mess that is Baba's flip-flopping between being a Kurosawa co-conspirator, but occasionally wishing to help the good guys by nature of his Church of Saejima involvement, this is not a fight that I look back upon that fondly. It's still a high C tier, but there was so many missed opportunities with Baba's overall inclusion to where I can't put this fight any higher on the list. Up next, we have Akiyama's final boss, that being Kanai. This UB-looking twat is someone we fought numerous times before, and his moveset has been copy and pasted all throughout the game's succeeding Yakuza 5, so you'd think I'd be utterly sick of fighting him in the finale. But strangely enough, this fight is actually pretty solid. First off, Kanai probably has the most believable narrative build-up out of any boss from the finale, primarily because he is such a simplistic character with a specific role to play. Much like Reiji and Laogui, this guy is a henchman, and merely a tool used by the real villain of Yakuza 5. The interesting thing here is that due to Kanai switching allegiances like underwear, we also have aspects of a different form of character archetype being thrown in, a la the final boss of Yakuza 6. This is someone you'll have great joy in dispatching due to the number of atrocities committed, and just looking at his involvement from Akiyama's standpoint, Kanai's acts led to the death of Park, the hospitalization of Horie, and he even went after Haruka. So even if you put aside the overarching power play engulfing the Tojo and Omi, this is a fight that Akiyama would immediately accept. Not just that, but he is effectively Kamurocho's last line of defense at the moment this boss fight starts. So the idea of a civilian dispatching an army of Yakuza one by one, all of which culminates in a satisfying beatdown of a despicable villain, makes this addition immensely satisfying. While the fight doesn't have a dynamic intro, the OST, End of Rematch, along with the fact we're fighting this army in the middle of Theater Square in the snow, gives this fight such an enticing atmosphere. Even if Akiyama isn't as fun to play as he was in Yakuza 4, going against the Kurohyou family is still fun thanks to his multi-targeting heat action and the feeling of joy once you see Kanai pathetically wind up his attacks as he's the only person left, makes the fight even better. He doesn't run away like Munakata or Tenkai, and by nature of us knowing his moveset from the previous fights as Akiyama, this feels like a nice bow on this particular arc that our favorite moneylender has undergone in the game. It's a personal fight, and it's awesome. While this entry is an overall B tier for me, when compared to the rest of the list, I really didn't expect that someone like Kanai would make for such a fun exhibition in the finale. But yeah, with that out of the way, now's the time to talk about the big one. The true final boss of Yakuza 5, Aizawa Masato, the man who is perpetually hailed as either the greatest boss fight of the series or the biggest asspull of a final villain with no in-between. Now, prior to the release of Infinite Wealth, I largely considered Aizawa to be the most disappointing final boss of the series, largely due to the page 1 rewrite that was forced on him in the very last chapter. I briefly touched on this during the Shishido character analysis, but to keep it brief, Aizawa's characterization was deliberate and succinct until we reached the finale and forced him into the position of the final boss. His writing between Chapter 1 of Part 1 and Chapter 3 of the finale portrayed him as a hot-headed but well-intentioned and loyal character who was still coming to grips with what it meant to be a Yakuza. The screen time we shared with him and Morinaga and the interactions between those two further facilitated that, to the point where the reveal of Aizawa's death in Part 1 felt like the perfect tragic ending to a character who deserved better. Even when he's revealed to be alive later on, his conviction is consistent with his writing from the rest of the game. But then we get to the finale, where he suddenly shares his father's convictions, actively contradicts nearly every piece of characterization he is given in any other chapter of the game, and conveys the reasoning as to why he deserves to lead the clan in ways that don't portray him as a character aware of their hypocrisy, but someone childishly pretending like their circumstances are different than those he actively ridicules and condemns. All of this to further the plans of a mustache-twirling villain with whom Aizawa hasn't spent a single line of dialogue conversing, despite being Kurosawa's own son. This is the shortest description that I can offer without drawing more parallels with the rest of 5's narrative, but essentially, it is this last-second 180 that ruined this otherwise promising character. Someone who has the potential to be a remarkable villain, as seen in his portrayal in Ishin, but fails to be one here. As for the fight itself, while most people will praise the hell out of it by nature of how many QTEs there are, personally, it felt like they should have taken a few out, because if you fight Aizawa well enough, you'll just be left with several minutes of unskippable action sequences, or alternatively, have your general flow of combat interrupted 7 times over. Is it cool from a cinematic standpoint? Yes, but not from a gameplay standpoint upon replays. The dynamic intro is great though, and a number of QTEs here felt like flawless additions despite my earlier remarks. Particularly the QTE right before you fall to the lower parts of the Tojo HQ, the one where you break through the door, and the very last QTE. Basically, if we removed some of the other embellishments and abridged the action sequence that dragged on from the throne room until we reached the ledge near the entrance, I feel like it would have benefited the tempo of the fight a bit more. Also, while I usually condemn healing phases in boss fights unless they have valid mechanical or narrative justifications behind them, Aizawa having a healing phase isn't a glaring issue with this fight. It's the fact that he has 3 of them. Mechanically, there is much that I enjoy about this fight. It's just that certain aspects of it should have been cut down, kinda like Yakuza 5 as a whole. Lastly, Battle for the Dream is a really nice song to top the fight off, particularly with the chorus section, so no complaints there. With all of my vehement criticism in mind, I'll still put Aizawa in a high B tier overall. Thanks to Infinite Well's final boss, it seems like I found myself looking more favorably at this particular koi bearer than I have in the past. Anyway, with Yakuza 5 out of the way, we now move on to the final boss of Ryuga Gotoku Ishin, Takeshi Hanpeita. Seeing as I've done a more detailed look on both the fight from OG Ishin and the remake in a dedicated tier list before, this will be an abridged look at the character. Takeshi is a brother figure to our protagonist Ryoma, and has taken it upon himself to help their father dismantle the then-current political regime in Japan, and usher them into a new era of prosperity. The methods he uses to achieve that, though, lead to the deaths of many, including the aforementioned father figure. So while Ryoma is looking for the culprits of this assassination, Takeshi makes connections all around Japan, all the while posing as his brother. The dynamic between these two was expanded upon steadily over the course of Ishin, so while their final encounter was to be expected, the way their interactions kept escalating over time resulted in genuinely shocking and comparably believable outcomes. It has all of the emotional weight of the fight with Nishiki, but further supported with the historical undertones Ishin is known for, and the end result is one of the most mechanically sublime boss fights of the series. The dynamic intro is perfect. The fight has some amazing transitions which are strategically placed to signal different stages of the encounter taking place, and Takeshi even switches fighting styles upon entering the aforementioned stages of the fight, utilizing the swordsman style for the most part, but also throwing in Wild Dancer in the midsection. The boss theme, The Assassination of Bodhisattva, is an 8-minute epic that I'd love to properly deconstruct as I did Mine's final boss theme, because the song utilizes various movements to complement the boss fight evolving from phase to phase. If we're talking mechanics alone, the version of the fight from OG Ishin is easily in the top 3 best boss fights of the franchise. However, there's a problem. Seeing as this is a joint placement for both the original fight and the one from the remake, this does damage the overall placement of the entry on the list, as the remake not only foiled the believability of the narrative exchanges by replacing Takeshi's actor with Shibusawa, but it also led to a mechanically inferior fight due to various combat rebalancing choices that make Ishin Kiwami such a hot topic amongst hardcore fans. Keeping this in mind, when compared to the other Yakuza final bosses, the totality of Takeshi's narrative, boss fight, and the dissonance between the OG approach and the remake warrant him a very high A-tier placement. As much as I adore Ishin, certain bosses have just left a stronger lasting impact on me, but nevertheless, Takeshi was a fantastic inclusion to the roster. Ironically enough, considering my comments on the actor from before, we now get to talk about Kiryu's final boss in Yakuza 0, Shibusawa Keiji. This character is a strange one to talk about, because he's a full-on one step forward, one step back type of addition compared to every other boss. On the one hand, he's given the spotlight very late in Zero's story, as we spent most of our time as Kiryu dealing with Kuze and Awano, meaning that Shibusawa wouldn't have that much time to be fleshed out. On the other hand, he's actually shown personally leading his underlings in instances like the hunt for Jun Oda and the sequence leading into the car chase scene. Similarly, while the game, in my opinion, fails to adequately portray him as a truly contemplative manipulator, he does make for an adequate ending to Kiryu's character arc, by nature of how well the Dojima lieutenants as a group were demonized and prominently shoved in our faces over the course of the story. Lastly, while his dragon-centric monologues are even more cheesy than Ryuji's, the way he tries to drag Kiryu down to his level after the fight concludes, and almost succeeds in doing it, makes Shibusawa the quintessential necessary evil to fully push our inexperienced protagonist into the next era of his legacy. Basically, balancing out the hopeful evolution from our interactions with Kuze by serving as the final chaotic test of our resolve. So yeah, narratively, I've always felt like Shibusawa was a mishmash of elements, but ultimately served his purpose as well as he needed to. The boss fight, on the other hand, is a marvel to behold. Epic dynamic intro? Check. QTEs that signal switch-ups in the fight's dynamic? Double check. A boss theme that serves as a symphonic rhythm and metal lead guitar hybrid? Hell yeah, that's a check. Also, we fight him on a boat at night while the nearby docks are doused in slowly dying flames. It's all just so solid throughout. While Shibusawa's moveset can be a tad annoying to fight by nature of his various multi-hit combos that are at times less telegraphed than most, this is a fight I still look back upon rather fondly. And while I don't think it's on the same level as the absolute strongest offerings of the franchise, I'd say Shibusawa still deserves a solid A-tier placement. And then on the flip side, we have Majima's final boss in Zero, Laogui. Another example of the Reiji character archetype of inhumane assailant. Naturally, due to his ever-persistent involvement, both Kiryu and Majima would have had personal stakes in aiming to dispatch this guy, but it made more sense for Majima to fight him, not just because of Laogui's attack on Makoto, but also the nature of how the Mad Dog himself was perceived back during the very first Yakuza game. Laogui is a worthy final test for him, because Majima would take quite a while after this to slowly tone down his apparent bloodthirst, perpetuated by the Mad Dog persona. So the fact that this fight didn't serve as a breaking point for him that would throw him into madness, but instead allowed him to set his own boundaries that would never be crossed, even when he became the over-the-top wildcard we all adore, was an excellent choice to cap off his personal growth. While there is little to no individuality to Laogui, beyond the fact that his atrocious acts led to an inhuman character design, the moveset he showcases was the perfect fit. He's not here for a flashy exhibition, he is actively in execution mode, and the nature of his heat actions is comparably brutal, making you feel the stakes of this fight even more. There isn't that much that I can add when deconstructing a fight like this after having gone through so many final bosses, because at this point, RGG knew exactly how to make a spectacle of a boss fight, all the while reaping the benefits of having fleshed out and mastered the technical abilities inherent to one of their best engines to date. Comparably to Shibusawa, I'd say Laogui also warrants an A-tier placement, both for the fight itself and for being a genuine improvement over the archetype we initially saw in Reiji during Kurohyou. Though Laogui wouldn't be the best iteration of it in the series, looking at someone like the Mole in Judgment, but we'll get there soon enough. Until then, it's time to shift to the first Dragon Engine game, Yakuza 6, and its offering to the final boss pantheon in the form of Kiwami. Kiwami is a very divisive boss, for very valid reasons. Seeing as Yakuza 6 was for a while believed to be the end of Kiryu's story, fans were probably expecting a mechanical marvel and a boss with admirable ideologies to serve as the final send-off to Kiryu. But looking at fan reception to early Dragon Engine combat, and the fact that Kiwami wasn't the type of villain anyone expected to see in the end, This guy was always going to have a rough time being compared to everyone else in RGG's catalog. Now, personally, I actually find Kiwami to be an outstanding choice as the last obstacle, because it shows a different side to Kiryu with how he handles this guy's involvement. The point that was hammered home multiple times in Yakuza 6 is that the age of honorable Yakuza was over, with Kiwami and Sugai being the most abhorrent bastards we'd faced off against by now. The fact that Kiryu was fully ready to end his legacy as a benevolent dragon who never willingly took a life carries immeasurable weight. What's more, is that this is the lowest level a final boss had stooped to thus far, and no matter how underhanded and despicable his tactics were, Kiwami is likely the only villain to have fully broken Kiryu in a way. But in turn, these steadily drip-fed antics will have pissed you off so much during the game that beating this guy into oblivion will be one of the most satisfying fights you'll have in the series. Like Kiryu says in his dialogue prompt, he is nothing to me. So the only thing that's left is giving us a satisfying fight from a mechanical level to round things out. And that's where things get a bit messy, depending on who you ask. One could argue that Kiwami didn't have enough health nor solid enough presentation to fully frame him as a worthwhile end boss to the Kiryu saga. But considering the way he was framed in the game, it's not like he deserved the red carpet treatment in the first place. We don't see him as a true Yakuza, so the only thing he gets is a solid action sequence in the middle and a dynamic intro that calls back to the final boss of Yakuza 3. Arguably the best thing about this fight are the boss theme, The Way of Life, and the nature of the arena where we fight, essentially being a memorial where everyone is fighting everyone. And personally, these additions make up for the lack of flashiness while going from phase 1 to 2, or the mechanical step back that early Dragon Engine combat was when compared to a game like Yakuza 0. While it's hardly the best the series could produce, the way this game decided to end was as melancholic as I would have hoped, and that includes the lead up and aftermath of this very boss fight. This may feel like an absurdly high placement to many, but for what this fight tries to do thematically and how satisfying it is, I'm gonna give it an exceptionally charitable low A tier. Despite everything, I can still see RGG's desire to keep experimenting and expanding on what a final boss can mean for a Yakuza game with this character, and I respect the hell out of that. Alright, to switch things up, we have a boss that is the most puzzling yet perfect conclusion to a game as over the top as Lost Paradise, Targa: The Ascendant. For anyone who may not have played this game due to its PlayStation exclusivity, or the notion that only fans of the Fist of the North Star manga would enjoy this entry, this probably feels like a joke entry compared to the bosses we've already gone over. However, Targa is a genius creation that, in many ways, can't be ranked by the same merits as other Yakuza bosses. For starters, Fist of the North Star villains tend to be evil to a comic degree, not in the sense of being incapable of being taken seriously, but rather that they're so over the top and absurd in how many casualties their antics will cause, to where you can only panic react by laughing your lungs out while approaching them. Targa is someone who has been around for a very long time in the story of Lost Paradise as a minor antagonist, and while I can't show you all of his antics, due to a number of them leading to takedown requests on the platform, this guy was a lieutenant of an army that wreaked havoc all across the wasteland. He perfectly emulated the fighting style of his leader to drive Kenshiro away from the army's plans, and at the end of it all, pulled the rug from underneath everyone by showing how he had his own underlings infiltrate the city of Eden so that Targa could lead the world into a second nuclear catastrophe. Explaining the extent of his involvement within this video would derail this tier list to a ludicrous extent, but all you need to know for now is that despite being an original creation to this game, Targa and his methods feel like a natural part of the world from the manga we're adapting. The fact that his attempts at being the god of a new world mean that Kenshiro gets to save the world from a disaster like the one that led to their society's initial collapse, all the while saving the love of his life, is as extreme of an idealistic push as you could get. Cause while this is nothing like our standard Yakuza character dramas, the essence of the fight still has that excitement that permeates throughout RGG's works. Targa allows for a bombastic finish with some of the best QTEs in Yakuza. He has an anthemic boss theme that is unlike anything we've heard before, the dynamic intro speaks for itself, And really, the only thing dragging this fight down is the nature of Lost Paradise's leveling system. Cause if you're a completionist like me, fighting him with a maxed out Kenshiro becomes a joke. And if you do it on a clean save file, the grind and challenge that will follow will test your resolve in ways you might not enjoy. Personally, between the uniqueness of it all, the fact that Targa gives this game a better ending than the source material, and the fact it got me interested in said source material, I could easily put this guy in a category of his own. But to keep my personal bias at bay, I'd say the nature of his writing and mechanical depth of the fight warrant him a high A tier, compared to standard Yakuza outings. Anyway, yeah, please play Lost Paradise. Alright, here we go with a boss that is an immediate S tier. The final boss of Judgment, the mole himself, Kurohyou Mitsuru. If you played Judgment, the quality of this boss should be self-evident, but in the event that you haven't, here's the Cliff Notes version. For most of the game, we are chasing a mysterious assailant known for gouging out the eyes of his victims, hence the nickname, the Mole. The closer we get to revealing the truth behind these attacks, the more proverbial red tape do we find, an aspect of which is exemplified in the ever-increasing meddling of Kurohyou, a model police officer that has such a perfect image no one would dare speak against him. Thanks to this game's excellent pacing with regards to unraveling the mole's identity, the escalations between Kurohyou and Yagami are comparably praiseworthy, to the point where every interaction with Kurohyou post-Hamura revealing his identity will have you on the edge of your seat. The interrogation scene in particular is a personal favorite of mine, cause it shows the villains so confident in their position that they have no qualms outright confirming our doubts to add fuel to the fire, and the fact we get to fight him before the final encounter makes the epilogue of this game even more exceptional by comparison, once we see Kurohyou fully snap. The fact that this psycho managed to stay hidden for so long makes the act of bringing him down satisfying in its own right, but then you get to the fight itself, and it's somehow even better than the associated narrative. Between the change in environments, the flawless dynamic intro, amazing action sequences, and the fact the guy essentially gets 2 boss fights in one, I find it hard to criticize anything about this encounter. Penumbra is phenomenal, we have a brilliant final twist regarding the Adode Kunai, and while Kurohyou's personal convictions aren't as relatable as what we're used to seeing from the more human villains in Yakuza, the fact that RGG nailed everything during their first new spin-off series since Kurohyou is nothing short of astonishing. As I've said before, this guy is an easy S tier. Going back to the mainline series, we have another shake-up to the formula, with the first turn-based final boss of the franchise. Arakawa Masato, also known as Aokiryo, also known as the Young Master, was a boss that I didn't expect to be as divisive in the community as he is. Part of that comes from the fact he isn't seen as the mechanical combination of the combat system like Tendo was, making Masato's fight feel underwhelming by comparison. But personally, I feel like this was the perfect fight to cap off the first Ichiban-centric game for a multitude of reasons. We've seen the nature of their dynamic all throughout the game, and as much as Yakuza 7 tends to elevate the importance of friendship and helping each other out, having anyone but Ichiban present in this final intervention would have taken away from the emotional impact that is the direct result of this fight's intimacy. There are no embellishments of reality that defined Ichiban's perspective of the combat. We're not even given a multitude of classes to comb through. We are to finish this journey in the same way as it started, just us and our fists. And I love that. Freelance's stronger focus on button interactivity and the glorious return of QTE segments makes this fight feel like a beat-em-up entry for a majority of the fight. The fact that Masato doesn't stand a chance against Ichi also makes sense, seeing as the former frequently hid behind his underlings and kept up with his political facade. So seeing someone befitting the political manipulator archetype be bereft of their influence, but still offer us an explosive fight, is not just an undoing of past design transgressions, but also a testament to this series being able to evolve because it acknowledges its roots. This is what the fights against Munakata and Tenkai should have been, just amplified by the classic brother versus brother dynamic that started the series. I feel like there's no need to retread the entirety of Ichiban's history with Masato, due to the story of this game being so widely beloved, and the fact this duo gave us some of the most memorable apexes of said story that in part led to such praise in the first place. The journey was long, the redemption hurt, but the aftermath was still hopeful and beautiful. While the fight itself may not be a mechanical marvel on par with the S-tier placements, the young master still deserves an A-tier placement for delivering such an impactful conclusion to the story and gameplay loop. Going back to the Judgment games, we have the final boss of Lost Judgment, a character that had the entire community debating on various questions of morality with interesting results. Depending on who you ask, Jin Kuwana is possibly the greatest creation by RGG Studio, with the single greatest boss theme ever conceived. And while I myself don't fall into that category of fans, I still find this boss to be S-tier worthy. While the qualities of his writing are apparent to most that have played Lost Judgment already, hell, even I made a separate video discussing the arguments he raises on the concepts of justice, there is a multitude of things preventing Kuwana from being the quote-unquote greatest villain many label him to be. Part of that stems from the fact that he is a direct personification of an ends justify the means mentality, but saddled with fulfilling acts that can't end the evil he is opposing. Unlike a narrative like Lost Paradise, where the strongest person can theoretically rewrite the world as they see fit, with nice supernatural abilities, the idea that bullying will end if you get rid of every single bully personally is oversimplifying the faults of human behavior to be something that can just be forced out in due time. One could argue that the fact Kuwana is pursuing an unattainable ideal further adds to the tragedy of his character, though that undermines the fact that he never would have gone on this crusade had he himself not been a perpetuator of the cycle he is now trying to undo. His negligence won't be forgiven if he rids the world of more bullies, which is something the game itself is aware of, thus painting Kuwana as someone who doesn't ask for forgiveness in the first place. But therein lies an issue. Looking at the evolution of his interactions with Yagami, it becomes clear that he's not a psychopath, and that he genuinely struggles with the thought of innocence getting caught in the crossfire. But this ultimately makes him an unbefitting tool to deliver the story of a person becoming a necessary evil to absolve the world of a greater evil. For the story of Lost Judgment to feel conclusive, you'd need to have someone like Light Yagami play Kuwana's role and meet a comparably heavy end to their journey. Otherwise, the character's arc could feel as inconclusive as the attempts at ending the concept of bullying as a whole. It has not been made apparent what, if anything, Kuwana learned from Yagami, or vice versa, and with the former being let loose in the end, this lack of finality damages the value of him as a villain, because the points he raises will more than likely be undermined in the next Judgment game, just as Yagami's achievements were, when looking at Kuwana's taunting of the former's accomplishments from the first game during their chat at the office. Using the prospect of something being unsolvable as an excuse as to why your villain and hero duo continuously reach an impasse in their discussion puts a damper on the adventure, because you realize that you're seeing an ever-perpetuating cycle that is essentially there to just remind you of its existence. So yeah, Kuwana is not the single greatest villain ever, but his involvement is nonetheless exceptional. Looking at the boss fights we have with him, you can tell he is intended to be a mirror to Yagami in terms of combat variety, with him even emulating some of the moves to taunt him in the first encounter. So between this, the fact we fight him multiple times, and the fact we tag team an onslaught of RK goons on a ship, this steady evolution of their quote-unquote rival dynamic makes the final encounter a marvel from the aspect of mechanical evolution alone. While I wish the fight was more difficult, and that it didn't have the stupid multi-button QTEs that plagued Lost Judgment, the final fight is really cool. Unwavering Belief might very well be the best boss theme conceived in a more modern RGG genre approach, relying on more electronic and orchestral elements. The dynamic intro is easily in my top 10 personal favorites, to the point where I wish this fight would just never end. Though it is a shame that the fight didn't have a third phase with one last action segment, cause compared to the fight with Kurohyou, this one ends rather abruptly, for being the final fight of the game. It might sound like I've done nothing but complain about the character for the entirety of the placement, but the thing is that due to Kuwana's position in the community, the onus of the discussion doesn't need to be on what makes him a good villain, seeing as that's considered general knowledge at this point. Instead, I felt it would be more important to focus on why he's not a perfect villain, despite showing the potential for being one for the purposes of this placement. Thus, this overtly contrarian segment that regardless had him landing in S tier, cause Kuana is awesome. Continuing on with the judgment-related bosses, we have one of the odder inclusions to the RGG roster, Shirakaba Yasutaka. I'll say right off the bat, I don't like this character, but the boss fight is really unique and kinda makes up for it. With regards to his narrative involvement, the final bout with Shirakaba is meant to be a fight for the love of Mikiko, Kaito's ex-girlfriend, and someone he clearly still has feelings for. The problem with this is literally everything else related to Shirakaba as a character. What started off as an attempt from him to take care of a patient eventually devolves into a disturbing one-sided relationship that can only be maintained due to the doctor lying to Mikiko regarding her family's attempts at reaching out and looking for her. While the initial avoidance could somewhat be excused, due to Kyoya being a nut job and the Crimson Lotus members clearly instilling fear into a still recovering Mikiko, the events that transpired beyond this point quickly make it apparent that Shirakaba is not hiding the truth of her identity to protect her, but so that she might one day fall for him as her quote-unquote savior. So the whole idea of fighting for her love feels incredibly asinine due to the selfishness he exhibited at the numerous points Kaito and Jun interacted with him. On the bright side though, once we get to the very last exchanges of the Kaito Files, the game almost makes it feel like this behavior was meant to get Kaito to finally confess his feelings to Mikiko, seen in how everyone, including Shirakaba, essentially nudges him to talk to her after the fight. I do like this ending, and while it may not have been intended for the Doctor to come off this unsettling for the most part, it nonetheless stuck out to me upon replays. That aside, I know someone could even point to Shirakaba's physique and consider that too to be a blatant asshole, so that a fight with him wouldn't feel as one-sided as, well, let's say Saejima vs Kido. However, due to the game already foreshadowing the guy's physical prowess back during Kenmochi's attack on Chiba, and how you can actually find dumbbells while searching Shirakaba's living room, I'd say the physique is less of a shock here than, let's say, Adachi's was in Infinite Wealth. Looking at the fight though, it is beautifully unique. We have an amazing boss theme oozing with tranquility, the Chiba environment making for a one-of-a-kind area for a boss fight, and while Shirakaba may not have a dynamic intro, and may reuse a number of moves from Shibusawa's moveset, the fact he has a full-on second phase to his fight, akin to the mole, coupled with that one final QTE segment, evens out the playing field for me. Seeing as this is but a DLC campaign, I was actually pleasantly surprised with the way it ended. So between Kaito's moveset and the uplifting nature of the final moments of the fight and narrative, I think Shirakaba did a solid job in granting us something cool and unexpected. As the final boss though, he will sit firmly in B tier. Next up, we have what I firmly believe to be the single best final boss that we've had up to this point in the franchise, Shishido Kosei from Like a Dragon Gaiden. Did I do a dedicated video discussing his qualities in detail? Yes. Should you watch it for a more comprehensive look on the character? Yes, if you have the time. Putting all of that aside, why is this character so frequently praised? Well, to use a common but oversimplified point of comparison as an example, he's essentially Aizawa, but good. This collective conclusion predominantly comes from the fact that Shishido wasn't saddled with an overtly bloated narrative that had to give him a page 1 rewrite to justify his position as a surprise final boss of the game. To be more specific than that, Shishido has always been portrayed as an old-school Yakuza with the brutality to boot. We face off against him multiple times throughout the story, we see him as our enemy, our complicated acquaintance, we eventually tag team Nishtain III's hideout with him, and when Shishido finally pulls the rug from underneath us, not only does it feel like a betrayal of trust, but it also feels warranted, due to the way Shishido was portrayed since his introduction in Gaiden. He's a person who will always look out for his own interests, and the fact that said interests at one point aligned with ours lured us into a false sense of security that felt justified by nature of how much time we spent with Shishido throughout the game. And once we think we put him down for good post his betrayal at the construction site, the guy just keeps on coming, utterly broken but still holding his own against the legends of the Tojo clan. This is a strength that can only come from someone being consumed with desperation, and his backstory only further adds to the weight of such actions. It felt like this fight was precisely what the game wanted to build towards since the first encounter when the Watase family attacked the Daidoji, which is why the boss fight could be as flashy as it wanted to without feeling like it's trying to make up for lackluster writing, as we've seen with some other entries on the list. As for the fight, it doesn't overstay its welcome by dragging on too long, nor does it piggyback off of previously experienced boss fights, as the way we progress through the Omi HQ has yet to be done in a one-on-one encounter before this one. Each QTE is used deliberately to transition us between key parts of the fight. Shishido's moveset is varied and fun, and he's even given 2 unique boss themes that couldn't be stylistically further apart. Personally, this is everything a Yakuza boss fight should be, and it pushes itself to absolute extremes with regards to everything, while somehow feeling like all of that boundary pushing was a necessity for the fight to communicate its essence to the player, and that's the highest praise I could give to a boss fight. It was the perfect ending to a brilliant game, and the fact Kiryu controlled as amazingly as it did in combat, compared to the beginnings of the Dragon Engine, only further amplifies the excitement surrounding this fight. So yes, in my opinion, Shishido is worthy of the top of S tier, no questions asked. And with that, we can move on to the final 2 entries of the list, both of which stem from Infinite Wealth, and both of which were already deconstructed in a dedicated boss tier list for that very game, so apologies for any possible repetition on my end. First off, we have Bryce, who serves as Ichiban's final boss. Drawing inspiration from the likes of Munakata with regards to being a manipulator hiding behind his underlings, and even taking cues from Nozaki Ryo, with the divine imagery that is turned on its head by the end, this guy was a hilariously great addition to cap off the cult arc that permeated throughout the game. He actively mocks what he represents, all the while manipulating those beneath him for shallow, monetary-dependent goals. Yet, with the presentation given to his encounter, you can't be blamed for seeing this guy as a deconstruction of the standard JRPG trope where the end of a game is signaled by a group of heroes using the power of friendship to kill God. The OSC impersonation should give you such vibes in and of itself. Once the boss fight actually starts, we see a continuation of a more recent trend, where major phases of the fight are jump-started by a new action sequence / mini-dynamic intro, making the struggle through Bryce's army feel like a natural build-up towards an expected goal. While Bryce himself is generally underpowered, when compared to some of the more technically challenging fighters in Infinite, as I've stated before, such a discrepancy fits with the archetype the character in question embodies. And plus, unlike with Tenkai or Munakata, you will still feel excited when you get into the final phases of the encounter, as opposed to feeling relief over being close to the end. Now, while this is one of my favorite fights in Infinite Wealth, comparing it to the rest of the series results in Bryce faring a bit worse than other bosses, if only due to my preference of beat-em-up over turn-based combat approaches, and him lacking the more enticing character writing that defines the finest villains of the series. Having said that, Bryce is arguably the best final boss that still relies on ads in his fight, so as far as this particular tier list goes, I'd say he's earned himself a strong B tier overall. And now, much to my dismay, we have to cap the list off with what I consider to be the most disappointing final boss of the franchise. Not the worst, but definitely the most disappointing. I will state my detailed reasoning for this at a later date in a dedicated video, but for the time being, let's look at why Ebina is a massive step down from the other final bosses in the series. Narrative-wise, he feels like a new attempt at creating the ultimate Yakuza villain, where instead of basing him off a specific archetype and then adding individual qualities to elevate him beyond it, the writers simply wanted him to be reminiscent of everything we've experienced thus far, all at once. We're meant to see him as a skillful manipulator a la Shibusawa, but also someone who is a foe of admirable strength, like Nishiki or Ryuji. Beyond that, we're meant to see him as a necessary evil to combat a prevalent injustice, a la Kuana, But we also need to see him as a person whose tirade has rendered his sense of compassion to be almost non-existent, leading to the character himself being an emotionally unbalanced psychotic mess, like the mole and, to a lesser extent, Mine. But amongst all of those elements, Ebina doesn't particularly excel in any regard, rendering him to be a culmination of tropes akin to what Aizawa was forced into being by nature of his narrative's last-minute reveals. Except this time around, the repercussions are even worse, seeing as Ebina is for all intents and purposes meant to be the final hurdle that Kiryu will have to overcome during his lengthy journey with the franchise. While the emotion in Kiryu's delivery and his ability to beg a victim of the Yakuza cycle of violence for forgiveness, for the sake of everyone involved, is a touching moment, the fact that such an unrefined character was the one to bring that out of him removes much of the value the resolution carries. Throwing in a bunch of seeds of potential substance, like writing Ebina to be Ichiban's long-lost brother, or having him harbor immense physical strength with virtually non-existent foreshadowing prior to the final monologue preceding the fight, renders this character to be someone with no genuine focus, because none of those innumerable points of reference were fleshed out to a point where they could offer a solid base, off which the character could be further expanded. But then, in an attempt to make up for it, he is given the royal treatment in his boss fight, with a great dynamic intro, an epic boss theme, and a moveset that screams finality. But when none of that is earned through a narrative build-up, yet the game desperately wants to frame him as an ultimate boss to be taken seriously, it all feels superficial in the end. And even when looking at what the fight does on a purely mechanical level, it doesn't feel like a test of your skills comparable to something like the fight with Tendo. It just feels like a fight designed to take a while and annoy you, under the guise that this individual is a genuine physical threat. Like you're a party of average JRPG heroes fighting an actual divine being, with all of his AoE attacks, the healing he relies on later in the fight, the general damage output, and so on. If a character like this was the first final boss of the series, all of this could be excusable, but this is the 28th in a line of diverse villains who, for better or worse, felt like they tried to evolve on what their predecessors may have done before. And in the case of Ebina, his attempt at continuing the cycle ended in failure. There's no way I could put this guy in the same tier as the likes of Munakata or Tenkai, but if there's anything I want the writers to take from this outcome, it's to give Ebina genuine focus in his writing down the line. Give him a dedicated Gaiden game, or bring him back in Like a Dragon 9 and show how he's changed and grown from these past experiences, so that one day he may become a character deserving of such a royal treatment. No matter how much I may criticize this character, the positive outcome I've just mentioned is one even I'm hoping for down the line, cause placements aside, I did enjoy all of these boss fights for one reason or another. Some have impeccable character writing, others have god-tier OSTs, but ultimately, a Yakuza boss fight is always a joy to experience for me, and something I rank at the top of my favorites list when looking at gaming as a whole. So, with all of that said, I hope you enjoyed my retrospective look on all of these various combatants. Let me know what else you'd like to see on the channel, and thank you once again for sticking by it for so long. Hopefully, we'll get to celebrate a 10,000 subscriber milestone in the future, with a tier list even more detailed than this one. But that's still a long way off, so I'll just keep doing what I've done until that time comes. So, as always, take care of yourselves, and have an amazing day. Cheers!